Joe Bessler is the Robert Travis Peake Professor of Theology at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so the middle of America. Phillips is a seminary that is affiliated with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Joe is the author and co-author of several books, including Law and Theology, Cases and Readings. He's author of The Scandalous Jesus, and the subtitle of that is How Three Historic Quests Change Theology for the Better. And he has a chapter on prayer in the book that I mentioned, The Historical Jesus Goes to Church. Joe is a cross-disciplinary theologian, enjoying conversations that open up theological questions in new ways. He's working on a new book, which is titled Moving Words, How Theology Proposes to Lead Beyond God. And in this book, he looks at ways that political and theological discourses overlap. Joe has worked closely with the Westar Institute, which we mostly know of as the Jesus Seminar Place, both in the latter years of the Jesus Seminar and in the beginnings of the God Seminar. In addition to his theology courses at Phillips, he offers various classes on the interaction of religion and culture. We are delighted to have you here, Joe, and to have you with us too, Laura, for this weekend of Common Dreams at Pitt Street. So please, everybody, join me in welcoming back Professor Joe Bessler.
Are we on? Thanks, Margaret. Thanks so much. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversations last night, and especially in the Q&A sessions, and look forward to really wonderful conversations throughout the day. Jason, I wish I could sit in on your on your session at noon. So it sounds marvelous. This morning, we're going back in time, and to kind of the classical theology as it emerges. We're going to focus here more on the, we'll do some developmental stuff, but kind of focusing more on the 4th and 5th century. The reason I'm fascinated with this is because so oftentimes people in our congregation, folks in our congregations, not simply Catholic, but if you're kind of mainline Protestant denominations, if you're Lutheran, Calvin, those kind of positions, we all grew up with variations of Augustine. And therefore it seems to me very important that we also explore how that Augustinian synthesis actually happened. Because too often I think folks in our churches, if not we ourselves, can think that this kind of classical theology, as it were, just descended on high, from on high. And we really need to understand how I think this theology came together as a construction. So I teach constructive theology. I want my students to understand that every theology is deeply embedded in a social, political, cultural context that shapes, that provides both a sense of avenues for development of a theological perspective, as well as, what shall we say, a worldview that has its own sense of evil and demons and the kind of wrong-headedness that theology can also embrace or steer away from. So this should be fun. Now, I wish that someone had told me when I began my theological studies that if you really want to understand Christianity, you really need to understand something of Platonism. Because this really is the kind of the classical worldview that Christians come to adopt. Quite opposed in a sense to, if one thinks of Jesus and Paul, if you've read any of the works of, say, Brandon Scott or Don Dominic Crossan or Marcus Borg, you're aware that these key pivotal figures, Jesus and Paul, for example, were really working in some ways against the Pax Romana of the Roman Empire. There is a real political concern in their rhetoric, and as Brandon says, Jesus revolted in parables. Nonetheless, over time, we're going to see Christians begin to change as they begin to get a foothold in that empire, and they want to adapt and to adopt some of the key language, some of the key philosophical language of that cultural worldview, precisely in order to be more persuasive to that worldview. So that they take up, again, a very different rhetoric of engagement as opposed to a rhetoric of opposition. Or, one could say, it's something of a mixed bag. There's both some oppositional language, even as there's an outreach to it. So let's go ahead and get started. It's Saturday morning. We're going to do a little stretching here, but I think this is going to be both quite manageable and I think fun. I would be out in front. There'll be some times when I leave the podium, but here I'm also kind of managing the screen, so forgive me for staying put. Here we go. So question. Notice Plato's dates. I've got those up here. So 5th to 4th century BCE, before the Common Era. So by the time even Jesus is born, as it were, the thought of Plato is kind of seeped into the cultural discourse. So even when I talk about Paul, for example, playing off a Platonic form or structure, I'm not saying that Paul was a scholar of Plato. I'm just saying that Paul was aware of this discourse within the culture. And he's a good enough rhetor, a good enough persuasive speaker to know how to pick up a form and use it and deploy it for his own purposes. So the other thing I'm going to be looking at here is in some ways the Republic. Not only that discourse of Plato, that dialogue, but somewhat primarily that. Because there's a question that kind of underlies that. What would be the form of an ideal city-state that would not fall prey to the vicissitudes of time and decay? Plato, they'll come across a slide in a minute, let me just get ahead of it. Somewhat like the author of Ecclesiastes in the Hebrew Bible, but sees civilizations rising and falling, right? He's concerned about his own Athens. His figure Socrates, of course, dies for his philosophical viewpoint, as he's the main character of Plato's dialogues. But he sees this and he's actually wondering, is there a way in which one could resist those forces of time and of decay? Is there a way that one could generate a city-state that could actually endure and thrive? And that's really the key question. It'll be very fascinating as we go through this to see what Christians and what St. Augustine in particular offers as a response to it. So notice this is a political question. It's a political question that Plato roots within human nature, within the kind of human beings we are, with the kinds of capacities we have, the kind of limitations we also have. And then he also sets that within nature itself, as we'll see, within a perspective of reality, right? It's the first kind of great major classical, and one might say, and there's other major figures, but Plato really develops an understanding of the cosmos, of reality as such, that is deeply influential, and that Christians play to, as we'll see. So already we can begin to identify a problem that's going to be identified and worked on in this dialogue, which is the problem of time, of change. We all live and die. We all go through that. And yet, he's thinking politically here. Is there a way in which the city-state can resist that process of decay? So along with this, time, change, and the way in which we are caught up within them, there's also an issue that he'll want to help us deal with. So here's the insight from Ecclesiastes. All is change. Is nothing sure? Ah, there it is. There it is. Is nothing sure? Is nothing stable? Is there no way one can resist or defeat death? Not simply personal, but cultural death. Right? So there's the anxiety, there's the longing. Is there a stability that can undergird? Is there a sureness that can undergird a political culture? What if? So what if? This is the what if that motivates the dialogue in a way. What if change is not the depth of reality? What if change is only the surface? Or, in another good Platonic term, what if it's only the appearance, not the fullness of reality? Right? An imitation. It's that suspicion, it's that hope, which underlies the experiment of the Republic. This is a profoundly moral document. It's a profoundly moral and intellectual excursion. So this will be fun. Okay, so now we're going to spend, 15 minutes doing some stretching into the Platonic worldview. So, is it possible that there is something like an unchanging truth? And if there was, how would we know it? Well, this is why I have to stay here to monitor these changes. Would it be the senses? Can the senses, we've got 5 senses, can they give us a sense of an unchanging reality? No way, says Plato. No. Why? Imagine, for example, that you're at a restaurant and you've got a glass of water and you've got a straw in the glass of water. How does the straw appear? It appears somewhat through the glass of water. It appears somewhat bent, doesn't it? Is it really bent? No. It only appears to be bent. Even sight, which is the noblest of the senses for Plato because it goes the farthest, in some ways is therefore the most accurate. Even sight doesn't give us a sense of sureness. Another example, let's say you've witnessed an auto accident and you're called to the jury box, or you're called to court, and you've given your testimony as to what you have seen. And then the defense attorney gets up and says, "Now I have just a few questions for you." And begins to say, "Now, are you sure you saw this? What color was this here? What did you see?" And before you know it, then you, even as a witness, aren't quite sure what you saw and what you didn't see. That's Plato. Plato's critique of sensory knowledge, that it doesn't get us, as good as it is, it doesn't get us outside of that process of decay and of appearance. He wants to get to reality, and by reality he means something sure and certain. So what about the passions? Oh my God, no! Plato has another story. I forget in which dialogue off the top of my head here, but it's the one in which there's a charioteer, and the charioteer is trying to rein in these horses that are going, and the horses represent the passions, and the charioteer represents reason, and the charioteer is often losing, right? So the passions are changing all the time. And so Plato's going to say, no, you can't, no. Passions, no. But what if? What about reason? And my initial response would be to say, here again, we change our minds all the time, do we not? But Plato's aware of this. But what if, he says, what if reason were educated? What if reason were educated? Then maybe that would be the case. So what does he turn to? Arithmetic. 1 + 1 is, assuming base 10, assuming it's 2. How often does that change? Notice we have to go to school to learn it. We're not born. We go to school. We learn arithmetic. +1. 3, reliably. form. We're seeing here not just a truth, but we're seeing a process. This process of addition, this process that's adding. And that is, the process itself is predictable. The end is sure. 1 plus... How long could we do this in principle? Right? To eternity. Interesting. And you know that symbol, right? The kind of like a figure 8 lying on its side, relaxing. That. Now let's see, that symbol, I'm forgetting what number that is. Is it, we say infinity, but what number? Oh, that's right. Infinity points to something we cannot finally grasp because it's infinite, because you could do this in, right? In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas will argue that we can know that God exists, but we cannot know the quidditas, the whatness of God. And he's thinking along these lines. In other words, through arithmetic, we can know that the infinite exists. We can't know what it is. That in itself is something that's quite powerful for Plato, right? So here he's got, in mathematics, he's got his foothold. He's got his foothold in a truth that doesn't change. He also has his foothold in a process of reasoning, a process that can actually get us to that point. More importantly, right? Yeah, I keep seeing these ones. Okay. So at this point then, Plato uses arithmetic as a clue to reality itself. And this again is kind of something of a leap. So here it's the idea of number. Now again, we have to look at this. Notice that number is not a physical thing. The number 1 is different than 1 lectern, or 1 pew, or 1 table. Number is conceptual. It's not emotional, right? It's not simply physical that we can perceive with the senses. It's only perceived with the mind. It's conceptual. Number points to the infinite, but demonstrates the reliability of reason when educated. Right? So that process is key. It shows up in a very significant section of the Republic, which we'll talk about in a minute. The truth of number doesn't change. That's his angling here. Number is conceptual, not physical, material. And can you see what he's beginning to leverage? A response to the problem of change. If changing is the problem, what is unchanging is the solution. All right? And then this is going to begin to open up so this opens up then the Platonic leap in terms of his worldview. What if ultimate reality is like the truth of number? What if it's like that? What if it's ultimately conceptual? And here, Plato devises this language of the forms, right? And so what's really real, hope this doesn't go off or anything, what's really real, and I love doing this with kids in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade when they show up with their parents at a Sunday school, and I'll say, now, for Plato, is this table really real? And they go, yes. And I go, no. This table is not really real. What is really real is the idea of tableness, right? In other words, it's the conceptual form. These participate, keyword, these things like 1 pew or even when you get to flesh and spirit. What is of the flesh, what is made, what is material, it's not that it's unreal. Plato does not want a strict dualism. He doesn't want that. But participates. So that the material reality participates, but is not the fullness of the real. right? And so that is this imaginative leap that Plato is developing here. And so there's all these forms. Now, for a good religious audience, it's important to know that the forms, of all the forms, these are reducible to three for Plato: beauty, truth, and goodness. And those three are resolvable to one, the good. Imagine that. I wonder what Christians might do with that. I just don't know. Right? There's this intellectual, this unchanging reality of the forms, three primary forms reducible to the good. Well, think about it. Then I think I've just been walking through this idea of participation, which is key. Participation, again, is essential for avoiding a kind of a strict dualism. So he wants to acknowledge the goodness of that which is in time, but it's not fully real. Right? So what that which is in time, us human beings, for example, what we have to do in order to secure a more perfect world, we have to cling to a more perfect world. We have to cling to that eternal, fuller view of reality. So this is fun. The importance of education. This is book 7 of the Republic. It opens with this. And Plato says, the process of education is like the following. And he tells a story, right? And so in this story, I can use perhaps Laura as an example at some point. But he says, imagine that you're in a cave. And this is, all human reality is in this cave. Imagine that you're seated and you're chained in. You're chained here at your neck so you can't turn your head. You're looking forward. Your hands are kind of locked in place. Your feet are locked in place. You really can't stand. And imagine that you've been like this since infancy. So it's clearly an imaginative kind of story, right? But you're in this cave, a wonderful image. And because you're locked in, the only thing you can see, here again is the privileging of sight, for example, is at the back of the cave. You can't see this, but in the back of the cave there's a light. It's like a fire. And in between the cave, that fire and the back wall, there are figures that are actually going back and forth between the fire and the back wall, casting a shadow on the wall in front of you. And as a result, because you're in this setting for your entire life, you come to take the shadows that are on the wall. Think of shadows in terms of that language of participation. Shadows are not unreal, but they're shadows of what is really real, right? So here's Plato playing with that language of shadow and reality. So all you can see are these shadows. We might translate that as conventional reality. There you are, you're stuck in it, right? But then imagine that someone comes from outside the cave and comes and takes the shackles off of Laura here, but then does Laura want to go? No, this is the world she knows. She said, what are you doing? Right? And so the person actually has to drag her out of the cave because she doesn't want to go. And then once she's out of the cave, her eyes are so blinded by this, what is it? That she's looking down and she still sees more shadows. So even when you're in the light, you're still seeing shadows. And then you gradually, this is what education does. What education does is take you out of conventional reality, begins to expose you to the light. And so the fullness of that education comes when you're able to see the light full on. That, for Plato, is the analogy to seeing the forms. That's the process of education. You go from shadow, participation, to truth. And that truth is that conceptual reality that we saw kind of in the language of arithmetic. But then, liking a good story, Plato says, now let's send Laura back into the cave to tell these people everything she's seen. How do you think that's going to go? Not so well. So she goes down But now her eyes are now, because it's so blasted dark, she's having trouble with her eyes. And the rest of us say, who is this silly person who's having trouble with seeing reality? And she tries to tell us what she's seen and knows, and people just laugh at her and say, can you believe this? How crazy is this? Education for Plato is for the few, not the many. Plato does not think of democracy in very good terms at all. He calls it mob rule. He's an elitist. Only the few can be truly educated. The others will be scoffers. Education. As a result of that, right, the ideal ruler of Plato's Republic is a philosopher king, not a business person, not a military general. No. If you're going to have a chance of enduring by clinging to the forms, you need a philosopher king to guide you, right? And someone who's therefore clearly above. The idea of kingship is very important here, right? As well as this sense of leadership that's formed by this connection with the eternal forms. So that gives rise to a kind of map of reality for Plato, right? And the really real above, so there's a tiered sense of reality. This is what would be fascinating in terms of when we get to literary analysis and allegory. But the really real is the eternal, what is unchanging, what is therefore spiritual and rational. I put a dotted line to again indicate participation rather than a solid line, which would be more dualism. But underneath that is just the paired kind of language. What is in time or temporal? It's real, but it's not fully real. What is changing? What is physical? What is, one could say, material? What is emotional? And oh yes, there will be gender to this as well, because males will be associated with what is eternal and unchanging and spiritual. Females, women, will be associated with time and change. Why principally? Childbirth. Right? So there you can already see some gender issues clearly developing, even as Plato, like any other philosopher, is looking around at his world and saying, well, who's in charge here, and who's doing what, and who's taking care of what. So again, this is how this kind of map plays out. You can also here put spirit and flesh. So he's also thinking about the body. And the flesh, of course, passes away. But what about spirit? Think of Socrates at his death, when he is being unjustly accused of corrupting the youth because of his education, because of his philosophy. And he says, you can kill the body of Socrates, but you cannot kill Socrates. Right? So here again, there's a whiff of immortality. There's a whiff in this structure of a relation between body and soul that's connected to the nature of reality as such. So this is quite fine. Then on this point, there's a logic of ascent to this. Remember the cave? In order to get real, you ascend, right? In order to teach, you descend. One of the very early images that Augustine will write about in his letters is Christ the teacher. Christ the teacher who descends from the eternal into the temporal. Right, teach. Augustine will have a proof for the existence of God in his earliest dialogue on free choice of the will. He says, I'm going to show you that God exists as surely as 7 plus 3 is 10. It's an arithmetic proof. Borrowing that logic right from Plato. So there's this logic of ascent from the temporal below to the eternal above. In the Symposium, which is on beauty and love, Plato uses the image of a ladder to show how one moves or climbs from the love of beautiful things, like flowers, for example, right, to the more conceptual love of proportion. Notice how that flower is put together. I mean, at first it just caught my eye with color and light, but now when I study the flower, I see the proportionality of the flower is also part of its beauty, a more intricate part of its beauty. And then the laws governing beautiful things. So everything that's beautiful is proportional, which is going to be somewhat different when you get to the sublime. And finally, to the love of the form of beauty itself. And that's where you get to the conceptual form. Notice the hierarchy. The ladder of participation from inorganic to organic, to the animal, to the person, to the eternal, that can be grasped by reason. This is a world not only of kingship, as we've seen, not only of two tiers, as we've seen. Plato likes hierarchies, right? So that's also going to be something that plays out. So here I'm just kind of asking, so at this point we're about done with our stretching. It's a workout. But I hope you can hear the eros in this discourse. There's a longing. And that longing is for stability. That longing is for permanence. That's what's real. In the midst of political strife, in the midst of constant political warfare, in the midst of political scheming, what there is a fascination for the permanent, for what doesn't change. Okay, that's that. So here, again, I want to watch our time, about 10:30-ish. Good. So I've already intimated some ways in which, and I think you're already beginning to imagine some ways in which Christian discourse can begin to work with that understanding of reality. Here are some New Testament resources for this. I'm going to talk about a couple of them. In 1 Corinthians 1 through 3, wisdom and foolishness, this is a favorite of mine in some ways, because here's Paul at the beginning of the Corinthian correspondence, what we think is the beginning here, 1 Corinthians. Paul has a real problem, a rhetorical problem. How do you convince people that someone who was crucified by the Roman Empire might in fact be someone worth listening to? So let's say you've got, I don't want to, let's say Warwick, who's back here filming us. We'll use him. So let's say I'm trying to talk to Warwick and say, you know, I've got this wonderful Savior figure, this wonderful Redeemer, this very powerful kind of Lord who I think, you should join us in following this marvelous teacher, this marvelous wonder worker, right? Tells these fabulous parables, and Warwick says, great, tell me more about him. So I do a little bit more, and Warwick says, well, tell me what happened to him. I said, well, he was crucified by the empire. And at that point, Warwick might say, gee, look at the time. I've got to get going. Right? I mean, why? Why would you then follow someone if this is a powerful figure, if this is perhaps an all-powerful figure? What are they doing being crucified along with thousands of others that the Roman Empire crucified? Right? So Paul rhetorically knows he has to get his foot in the door here. So part of what he plays to in 1 Corinthians 1 to 3 is this language of foolishness and wisdom. He says the cross is foolishness to the Greeks. It's an absurdity to the Jews. But to us who are being saved, he says, it is the wisdom and power of God. Right? So where does he get that argument? Where does he get that? He gets it, I think, in part from that Platonic discourse that's in the cultural water. Right? So Plato has Socrates go into the public community, right? And again, we'll use Warwick here. And Plato is kind of bedraggled looking, and his disciples aren't too keenly kept either. But sees Warwick, who's kind of done up in his fine robes, and says, "Oh my God, I can't believe our good fortune. Warwick is here, and he knows more about the gods than anyone else. Warwick, would you please give us a lecture on the nature of the gods? Says, sure, I'd love to, Socrates. Let me help you out. And proceeds to give this fabulous oration, at the end of which Socrates just can't believe it. It's so wonderful. He applauds. He says, oh my gosh, that's the best thing I've ever heard. I just have a few questions. And with one question after another, Socrates dismantles the speech. So at the end of the speech, who appears wise and who appears foolish? Right? This is something that the Socratic discourse does almost in every dialogue. And what's going on there? He takes what appears to be wisdom and deconstructs it, as it were, in order to reveal a different wisdom. Right? And so in the same thing, Paul's up to something similar here in this text. Just as in Romans 8, where Paul's going off on this play of flesh and spirit. And if you look at that text, you say, does Paul have to explain which is better, flesh or spirit? No. They all clearly know. Spirit's better than flesh. Where did they get that idea? In part from the Platonic worldview that's already kind of seeping into the groundwater. Allegory in Galatians 4. Now there's a text to look at. If we had all day, we'd do a little kind of Bible study around this text just to see the bizarreness of it in a way, right? But in Galatians 4:21 to 31, he ventures this reinterpretation of Sarah and Hagar and what these two figures symbolize, two covenants, and off he goes. But the idea of allegory is itself a Hellenistic mode of interpretation. It's not a Jewish mode. Paul is not getting this language from his Jewish tradition, unless it's from someone like Philo, who's also into a similar kind of gambit, engaging Greek philosophy. But rather, what does allegory do? Allegory assumes that a text has several layers of meaning. There is what Origen will call the fleshly level. That's the basic common sense level. And then for those learners who are making progress, right, there's a spiritual level. And then for the really perfect, there's a yet more spiritual level, right? So even here, allegory, again, somewhat like Plato's political hierarchy, is going to say there are ordinary readers, don't expect much from them, but they can at least do a few things. Then there's some improving readers, and then there's the first-class readers, those who really get it. So here again, in the language, you'll find more allegory in Hebrews 8 and 9. I'm not going to talk too much about Melito of Sardis' homily on the Passover, except to say that he uses, it's one of the early texts, about, I think, 150 to 200, where we see a Christian author using allegory, and the allegory of the Jews leaving Egypt to vilify Jews, to throw the Jews under the bus, which happens. So neither Paul nor Jesus lived for the destruction of the temple in 70. And then in around, it's near 147, my dates here. You have another kind of war of Jewish people with the Romans, which is viciously put down. And here Christians begin, you can almost see them begin to rethink their connection to Israel and begin to say, these people are getting wiped out. We're going to, so rhetorically, they kind of, Christians here begin to throw the Jews under the bus. They begin to use allegory against the Jews. They would say that whole Jewish covenant, that was a covenant in which those Jews longed for the flesh. They longed for the fleshly Jerusalem, right? They were concerned with we Christians, we long for the spiritual Jerusalem in heaven. And so you begin to see Christians deploy allegory against Jews. They're also in time going to deploy it against the very Greek systems that they're using. So some of what's happening in this language, as Christians begin to adopt it, that Platonic worldview, they also begin to strategically deploy it. So here I'm just going to do, we'll do a little bit more in terms of the search for a wider narrative. So imagine again that you're an early follower of Jesus, and here you are. Jesus is this little figure in the tidewater of the empire, back here in Judea. Lives, dies, great. Again, how do you begin, rhetorically, persuasively, to convince people that such a person actually has a kind of global significance? What do you need to do to help convince folks? So here, notice even as Paul, this earliest of texts, we don't hear much about Jesus, about the life of Jesus. We hear about the Christ. We hear about Jesus Christ. There's language of significance. Think of Christ. Think of Word. Think of Son of Man. Think of Son of God. This language that, again, more contemporary biblical scholars would say, it's not as if the disciples were walking around with Jesus saying, "Tell us, Son of God," but these are labels that are put on Jesus in the developing and early tradition to highlight the significance of Jesus, that people ought to be paying attention to him. So here's this language of Christ, of Word, the currency of divinity itself. I mean, did Moses have to be divine in order to be significant? No. Did Jeremiah have to be divine? No. What's going on with this language of divinity? Perhaps it's that the emperor is walking around, as a number of scholars, and certainly this is well discussed in the Jesus Seminar materials and Crossan and all those folks, the emperor is declaring himself divine. So in a world where there's a certain kind of competition of ideas, divinity becomes a language of currency. How important is your hero? Is that hero divine? Just saying. These become argumentative terms. There's also then the sense of a hidden God who, like the God who is in eternity, don't trust the appearances. Right? Our God is more powerful by virtue of remaining hidden. So there is this attempt when a Greek philosophers dismiss Christianity and say, "Oh yeah, they have a crucified Savior and blah blah," and where's the evidence of this divine power? It's hidden. Right? So again, in the early centuries, that tends to be the case. But then, the manifestation of God in power also becomes apparent. Christians will take advantage of a changing political situation. So the Platonic view of reality, with its play of appearance and reality, provides a rhetorical, coherent model of interpretation. You can both say, yes, there's an historical Jesus, but then beneath and within that historical Jesus is really the divine man. He's both flesh and spirit. And because Jesus as the Christ is the one point, this is too fun, is the one point where the eternal touches the temporal. Right? In this worldview, that's as good as it gets. There's going to be no other religious leader, no other religious figure who can say, boy, this is the fullness, this is what the doctrine of Chalcedon will say in 451. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. He's the one point where the divine touches the temporal. So given that, the two main feasts of Christian faith are the points at which the divine enters the human. We call that Christmas. And the feast where the eternal ascends both is resurrected from the grave and ascends. It's Easter, Pentecost. Are they interested in the historical Jesus? No, not really. As Bob Funk liked to say, you've got the creed. Look at the creed. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. And Funk would say, that's where the historical Jesus is, in that comma. They're not interested because the worldview is telling them what's really important. What's really important is where the eternal comes in and the eternal returns, right? And therefore, what you're most interested in are those. You're most interested in the Gospel of John, which really talks about the Word. You're really interested in miracle stories where the divine is made manifest, right? You're interested in aspects of Paul. You're certainly interested in the text of Hebrews, which is very Platonic. But in a Platonic worldview, in a Platonic Christianity, which again is basically from the 2nd century all up into the 17th and 18th, and well, in many of our churches, we're still connected to a more deeply Platonic model of reality, more so than we think. Because notice what has to happen here. The focus of a religious life that adopts this worldview is then precisely because Christ is the eternal one who then is raised back to eternal life. The goal of the life of faith is not to pay attention to this world. This world is time and change. The whole point of faith, I hope this sets you up a little bit, Jason, for the whole point of faith is to escape this world. It's to get to heaven, because that's where the eternal life will be. That's where we Christians really trump Plato. Because in the end, we really do have a worldview and a view of reality in which it is possible, thanks to the gift and grace of God, that the chosen are with God for eternal life, and there's nothing that's going to overthrow that. Right? But think of what that's also, how that's orienting our view of spirituality in terms of ascent from this world to a more perfect world. The view of spirituality is not moving into social transformation. No, far from it. The social transformation is that we're focused on heaven. Right? Now there's moments when that can lead to a kind of political critique, but in many ways it often yields a kind of privatized view of faith. So early Christian theology, and I'll just kind of well, we've been through a few of these folks. Justin Martyr, in his text, this is about the first reference I know to Plato, where he is writing both to the emperor and to the Senate of Rome, and he's saying, he's on his way to execution, and he's basically saying, you're making a mistake here. The Greeks themselves are famous for executing the wisest person who participated, notice the language of participation, who participated in the logos and wisdom. And that was, of course, Socrates. And you would think that you would have learned from that experience, but no, you are now persecuting the followers of the whole Logos. He quotes the Gospel of John. You're now persecuting the followers of the whole Logos, who came to be the definitive teacher. What a mistake you're making. Well, it didn't save his life. But it's one of the first references we have to both Plato and Aristotle, in which he says they participated in the wisdom of the Logos. But we Christians are the fullness of it. So even as early here, you have a whiff of a Christian argument that seeks to supplant the Platonic one by saying we're the ones who have the really real truth. It's like going up another layer over and beyond the Greeks. Origen, who's considered around 200 to have written the first systematic theology, it's all allegory. The whole model is allegory, saying here's the level, here's the fleshly level of the meaning of the text. This is for beginners. And then you see a more advanced level, and then you see the readings or the interpretation of the perfect. And he walks you through those different levels of interpretation. Right? So this is considered really one of the founders of theology. The Nicene Creed, think of that language that the Logos is homoousios with the Father. That's hardly biblical language. That the one in being with the Father, right? And part of the reference of that one in being with the Father, argued about by Athanasius and then Arius, who was saying, it sounds like this one in being of the Father means we have two gods. And Athanasius saying, look, bud, I mean, I'm summarizing here in kind of in a more colloquial speech. Look, mate, in fact, if we don't say that he was one in being with the Father, some other religious group is going to come along and say, I see that you've got your salvific figure here is pretty close to God, but our religious figure is even higher. So what Athanasius realized, what the council realized, and this is more strategic thinking, is that you had to seal that identity. That the God who created was also the God who saved. And the God who saved is also the God who heals. Hence the Trinity. They're working through the Platonic logic of the Trinity, only really trying to seal all the connections. So this is Athanasius, and then Augustine is the great synthesizer. He's the one who, and again, I need to stop here in just a second. Augustine's the one who is converted, I think about in 384, I think 3 years before Theodosius in 387, declares that Christianity is the official religion of the empire. Right? Now, we'd already been the favored religion since Constantine in 313, but Augustine becomes the theologian, and he's a rhetorician by training. And he's the one who realizes that, oh my goodness, if we're the official religion, then we have to make sure in our theology that everybody needs to come to the Christian church in order to be saved, and that they then have to stay in the Christian church in order to be saved. So within this comes a whole number of teachings like original sin. Why original sin? Pelagius at the time said, what are you talking about original sin? Adam and Eve's sin just affected them. And Augustine says, oh no, when Adam fell, we all fell. Why? Because only by that logic can you then say, and everybody then, if that's the problem, original sin, then we need a move of correcting that. Everybody has to be baptized. And then you say, okay, we've been baptized, now we can scoot on out of church. No, because by yourself and by your own will, Augustine will argue, you're going to hopelessly fall back into sin. You need to stay in the church and receive the sacraments, which are going to keep you on the road, and you need the constant supportive grace of the Holy Spirit. Because without that grace, you cannot be ultimately saved to eternal life. And Augustine is the one who synthesizes biblical texts with Platonic worldview in a way that is, again, the more one studies it, the more one's fascinated by it. And of course, when we talk about the rise and fall of the Christian myth, finally Joe gets to the punchline, I suppose, but it's what happens when that Platonic view of reality is seriously questioned. When it's no longer simply that worldview that is understood as persuasive. This is going to happen, this is going to begin to happen with the rediscovery of Aristotle in the West in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Aristotle begins, his student begins, and it's kind of bizarre that we're 13 centuries in and Aristotle is the new language, the new knowledge. Sweet Jesus, right. But then there's going to be the Enlightenment. Then there's going to be science. Then there's going to be the whole notions away from monarchy, which Christianity had again embraced in terms of the language of hierarchy, monarchy. Political freedom is going to throw a real elbow at this. And so at that point, folks, you have different responses in Christianity, many of which are simply a kind of digging in. No, God doesn't change. We learned this from Plato. And therefore, what you're all changing is secular humanism. We're grounded in the truth. And it's going to be that kind of intellectual and moral, theological response that begins to create both a divide between more conservative stances of religion and more liberal ones, between more conservative stances of religion and more scientific explanations of reality, more democratic explanations of reality. And those tensions continue. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for stretching us and helping us reconnect some of the implications of that. I'm just going to give people a few minutes just to chat to each other, and you can talk about whatever you like, but if you want a focused question, I wondered if you could just have a think about how that classic Christian myth, so deeply influenced by Platonic thinking, has impacted your own faith, or if you're not a person of faith, at least impacted your understanding of religion. So just take a few minutes to have a chat about that. Yeah. Okay, we've got people with microphones, so if you would like to ask a question or make a brief comment, and we're going to do what we did last night, is just kind of keep a mix of gender going with that. Please raise your hand, and Joe will have and I'll try and keep track of people's hands, and we'll move around. Yeah. So, Jason.
We're hoping this isn't too much of a tangent, but we're thinking about the Greek gods and Plato, because the Greek gods were very kind of involved and kept popping down and doing all kinds of weird and terrible things. So had that idea faded by the time Plato came along, or was he trying to undercut and change things? Or?
I mean, I'm not an expert in that literature, but yes, Plato is recognized as one who is trying to rationalize the gods. As it were, and is also, so there was even the notion of allegory. Allegory developed. I studied with a specialist on this at University of Chicago, Michael Murin, on allegory. And allegory developed initially as a defense of the gods, of the morality of the gods, because when the gods would come down, they'd always be having this illicit sex and all of this other stuff. And yet, when kids would go and learn to read, insofar as there weren't even well-educated kids who were doing this, here they were encountering these immoral stories. And so allegory developed as a defense of Homer by saying, oh, that's just the appearance. That's just the surface level of the text. The real meaning of the text is working out some other kind of dynamic. And so, and then later you have someone like Plato really trying to think through what's going on in the language of divinity and conceptualizing it rather than having these figures ascending and descending. So at that point, Plato will say, yes, even Homer and the gods in Homer are a kind of appearance, and what's really real is what those gods, in some sense, conceptualize. What they're. Yes, sir, or whoever. I shouldn't be doing that. I should be.
Just a comment on Plato and the philosopher king.
Yeah.
My understanding is that he subsequently went to Syracuse and tried to turn the tyrant of Syracuse into a philosopher king, and it was an abject failure.
Yeah.
Does this say something about listening too much to philosophers?
I love that. Perhaps so. Insofar as, again, once Christianity, I'll opt out of that story, but once Christianity really begins to establish kind of its doctrinal teaching within a Platonic format, it becomes very difficult within that whole unchanging, all-powerful God, because even there, the Christian God is a kind of a wedding of the philosopher king, but also the emperor. I mean, they are learning from their political circumstances, and so this is a universal emperor, even stronger than the Platonic figure. So what happens then is once these, and I don't think Christianity is utterly unique here at all, but once you get into kind of digging in such truth claims, it then becomes institutionally very difficult to move beyond them. And therefore to begin to acknowledge that, oh, that was a construction, rather than, no, that was reality itself, when we're still defending reality itself. Right, so thank you, that's...
Karl Marx once said, philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. In my early research, I discovered that hermeneutics was often discussed, and especially very early on during Plato's time. I was wondering, what was Plato's first philosophy in interpreting the Bible?
Well, Plato didn't. So Plato lived so far before Christ. Now, what's interesting is you had Christian apologists, and perhaps even Jewish apologists, who said, like Philo, that Plato learned everything he learned from Moses, when in fact there's no evidence that there was any point of contact there. So my point here would not be that there's only hermeneutics all the way down. There's also rhetoric all the way down. And even some of my beloved teachers don't like to hear that as much as, because we're always trying to frame a persuasive idea. We shouldn't be embarrassed about that. It's not a point of shame. We don't possess universal truth. We need to make proposals, and then also allow those proposals to engage others, and perhaps we get some sifting out of what is a more adequate, given our range of evidence, given our understanding of the world. But yes, the rhetorical character of these theologies is also something that fascinates me. And I'm less a student of that ancient philosophy than I am of the Christian theology. So I kind of know that a bit better on this.
Thank you for over here. Yeah, thank you for your presentation, which I like the way you said this is fun. It was fun. You know, it really took us on a roller coaster ride. And it made me think about if we think that Platonic philosophy is flawed because of all the reasons that you outlined. And we've got a term in Australia, I don't know whether you use it in the US, but we say taking the piss, which means that you're kind of making a bit of a ridicule of the thinking process. And I sat here and I thought, yes, he's taking the piss out of the theological imagination of the first 4th centuries. And I like that. I think we have to do that. We have to look at it and we have to say, there's something essentially masculine, there's something essentially, paternalistic about that way of thinking. But then it made me think, are there any other voices? Are there any other voices in the first 4 centuries? Is there any other theological imagination that is non-Platonic? Or do we have to look outside of Western culture and civilization for that? And in our discussion, we mentioned about the possibility of a matriarchal societies and whether they have a very different world view because they're non-Platonic. But that's just a question that I put.
Right. There really are. I mean, there's so by focusing on this kind of chain of thinkers, I'm not, so for example, I think, was Hal Taussig here, did he, right? So Hal would have, I think, would talk about the Gnostics and say, because as early as the 2nd century, you had Irenaeus, a bishop of Lyon, saying, oh, there's all these kind of false teachers, these folks who are, they're all Gnostics, they're kind of false wisdom kind of folks. And as Hal was saying, because the early Christianity seminar studied this in really some depth, it's that there really was no school of Gnostics. These were different religious voices that were basically lumped together in order to say you're false, right? And so you already had, and this think of Irenaeus in terms of about 180. There's already a kind of a positive kind of engagement of a certain philosophical thought that's already willing to make judgments about you're wrong, even though you're claiming to be Christian. You've got the wrong idea, and we've got the right idea. And so there's, yes, one could begin to surface a range of voices. Here, I wanted to really focus on those voices that were going to engage this Platonic worldview, precisely in order to, as it were, overcome it, in order to then claim that Christianity was the authentic inheritor of this, but also superior to it. So you could see the language of allegory being played out, you could see the language of participation and all that. And it's not just the first 4 centuries. So then you also go, I mean, this basically stays in place even once the rediscovery of Aristotle happens. You know, even Thomas Aquinas, who vaults the tradition of Aristotle, is also going to make sure he agrees with Plato every step of the way. So in that sense, yes, there's a longer tradition, and there are other pieces to retrieve. For example, a number of feminist theologians really want to rediscover the Christian mystics and find in the language of mysticism a political resistance, not simply a spiritual discourse, but also a political resistance. In both women mystics and then in others like Meister Eckhart, where you've got Eckhart writing in German, and those German sermons and all could be viewed as politically suspicious. So in some ways you've got folks who are interested in reclaiming aspects of the tradition. Canadian theologian Douglas John Hall, kind of a neo-Orthodox thinker, says we've really done too much with Christian triumphalism. What we really need to do is rediscover this tradition of the suffering in terms of the cross. So you've got various kinds of voices wanting to reclaim aspects of the tradition, precisely in order to be more prophetic witnesses, perhaps about, and here you'll get some interest in mysticism aligned with the reclaiming of the earth. So you have some spiritual theologies that can connect mystics with an affirmation of ecological concerns and those kinds of things. So yes, lots going on.
Could I just add that alongside the traditional theology and the mainstream church, there was always the esoteric Christianity that manifested in different ways at different times. And it's very interesting that Augustine himself was brought up in a Manichaean family and became incredibly hostile to the Manichaean stream, and which had been incredibly successful and widespread in Europe. And then we see that same stream emerging with the Cathars, in the south of France, with the Bogomils, with the Templars, etc., running right through to the modern times. So there's always been that alternative esoteric stream.
Right, and some of that stream is even more dualistic. I mean, finally, right, in that sense, even more, a sharper degree of spirit and flesh, and therefore it can even be a sharper sense of villains and heroes and that kind of thing, which can then argue vis-a-vis a tradition like Augustinian that has kind of made its kind of middle way peace with the empire, that can always say, we're the purer form than you. And so there are fascinating kind of tensions that get worked out.
This idea you've got to get rid of the heretics, burn them.
Oh yes, well, right. Well, that's what orthodoxy does. I mean, orthodoxy gives you a sense of here's right teaching. And if you publicly begin to express false teaching in public, we have to shut you up for the good of the society. I mean, that's how the logic, the very disturbed logic, works, and how perverted it is.
Okay, just for a bit of variety, go to Kathy and then Bill. Gender.
Thank you very much. I've never heard of an explanation of all of those influences before on how we think now. What I'm wondering is, can you give us an explanation of dualism and why we're rethinking that? I mean, it's flesh, spirit, male, female, good, bad. I mean,
right.
is it as stark as that, good and bad? And is that why it's necessary to now rethink it, or
right.
have a more holistic view, or something like what Jason might be saying?
Yeah. Right. So again, you do have sharper kinds of dualism. In some ways, Manichaeanism is a sharper dualism of light and darkness, right? These are often, sometimes naturalistic imagery is brought to bear here so that the good is affirmed with the light, even in the Platonic kind of piece, and that which is in the darkness. And so there have been, among Toni Morrison and other kind of writers of color, there's a sense of saying, how deeply ingrained is our suspicion of darkness and therefore of blackness, and even the ways in which that can play out. So I just thought I'd throw that in. But in terms of the strict dualism, that tends to be played out in terms of, or often is played out in terms of spirit over the flesh. And then what has to happen in that more dualistic is that the flesh has to be disciplined. So this is why you have arguments on behalf of virginity. This is why you have arguments even on behalf of beating the self in order to get it to submit to the spirit. So there's a number of problems that really do, moral problems, problems of shame that often are kind of deeply associated with kind of strong dualistic patterns of thought, and why one needs to kind of rethink that dualism in more creative ways. That dualism also leads to a kind of political dualism. So again, in terms of culture, that spirit-body kind of split, once you, or that connection, notice it goes spirit-body, it explains the human person. Spirit and flesh can also begin to explain some of the politics in terms of the higher levels and the lower levels of society. So, and then it also goes to the intellectual, the whole view of the cosmos, in which there's the eternal and the temporal. When you begin to get those kinds of overlapping logics that explain the cosmos, the political, and the personal, all in a similar way, you are in the presence of a worldview. You're in the presence of a thinking through of reality that has that kind of consonance from even the smallest things to the grandest. And so what really happens is, in my argument in terms of modern worldview, is that there really is a tendency to press away from that dualism into a much more kind of integrated kind of model. You see that in terms of moving away from hierarchy. You move away from kingship. You move away from, if you begin to move away from male-female, from that kind of isolated, kind of hierarchical relationship with gay and straight. You begin to be, what are the ways in which we privilege groups of people of color, of whites, the ways in which this habits of privileging people gets set up within hierarchies. What begins in the modern period, we're still living out. We're still unpacking that democratic ethos, even now to the point where the earth itself, which is not a human being, but the earth itself, one might say, has a voice. And the earth itself is now, is in many ways at the center of some of our most political and, of course, not just ecological thought, but political and moral thinking, because we have to resolve that issue. But boy, it's still oftentimes stuck in a dualistic, well, we people are more important than the earth, right? So all of these things are getting unpacked because they have such profound consequences for how we think about reality.
Okay. We are going to break at 11 o'clock, and Bill has been waiting for a while, so I'll go to Bill, and I apologise for those who I recognise we're not going to have time for in this session, but I hope you get to keep having good conversations. So, Bill.
My question's relating to unexpected gifts. You might call it gift of the spirit, or the unexpected encounter, or the momentary or brief encounter. Riding on a train a few weeks ago to church, I was sitting next to a man of, I think, Indian background with a small child. We had a brief engagement, a brief encounter. You can be open to that or not open to it. You can be sitting in the train looking at your device the whole time, or you can be open to what's around you. Yeah. You can choose to go through the automatic checkout and have a nice voice tell you thank you for shopping at the fresh food people, or you can go and wait in the queue to the checkout and have a brief encounter with the person, the human being there. You can go out into the world and see some beauty of nature And somehow or other, there's a gift comes down, a reality, a truth, which doesn't necessarily, I don't want what did Plato do with that, or what do we all do with that way of knowledge or understanding truth?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I think, again, one doesn't need a Platonic view of reality to suggest that the human being is a kind of open, is this open structure in terms of learning. That in some ways, I mean, I remember Karl Rahner saying, the fact that we're open to knowing anything indicates that we're open to knowing everything. That there's a capacity for engagement, or there's a capacity for difference. Because oftentimes we live, and again, in a kind of a conventional worldview, but we have a capacity for understanding even beyond ourselves that is itself a resource. Now, for some, this might really be augmented with a belief in God, with that as a God-given kind of gift. This is what it means to be in the image of God, again, in terms of this capacity for this kind of openness, this capacity for difference. Others might say we don't need the theological language for it. But in that sense, then what we encounter in that difference can at points confirm, but at other points begin to challenge and call us to grow. So a number of theologians, thinking of Greta Vosper, I'm thinking of John Caputo, really like the language in some sense of a sense of call that we do in our lives experience. Even Don Cupid did this with respect to ethical imperatives, that we can experience a sense of call that draws us out of ourselves and into engaging a kind of there's both a moral or a learning or a engaged situation. And for Caputo as well as for Vosper, they're saying that experience of the call, one need not posit a God figure calling you, but that language is still persuasive in the sense that we do experience this. We experience opportunities that draw us out of ourselves. And so again, there's going to be a range of theological authors and viewpoints that will try to help address that.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for your engaging questions and comments. I think that did lead us to a deeper place, and Bill's question was a great place to take a break and get some coffee and some tea. Please join me again in thanking Joe for a very stimulating morning.